This is a radio broadcast addressed from the League of Nations on the global war effort against the Morgana threat, where we report the recent happenings amongst the major nations contributing to the defense of our united front. I am your speaker, Ammaraglio Maus, but you may refer to me as Commissar, or simply the Speaker, whichever you or your government prefers. With our first official week of December, we find ourselves at the boiling point in the Baltic as war seems to have begun and the Soviets move to occupy Finnish land. Alongside that, Morgana plots begin to deepen as reports from around the globe lend credence to the theory of the Morgana's growing intelligence. And despite all that, some nations still attempt to use diplomacy to settle their issues and align one another to their side for the likely inevitable coming conflict. First up, news from the League itself. For the past few weeks, the League has been considering the proposal of inviting another major into the fold, with the two most likely candidates being the Kingdom of Italy and the United States of America, due to their efforts against the Morgana and positive standing with the League. Suffice to say, the world had changed immeasurably since 1920, and the argument for a common forum for deliberation and coordination between the nations had never been stronger, and it was hoped by members of the League that the Americans finally would agree. It was said that the world would require a powerful nation, divorced from the current conflict in Europe, to act as custodian for Morgana-related research and possibly as the most neutral arbiter possible in its potential uses and applications. And this would be the United States' role if she consented to membership. This offer would be submitted to Washington directly, and we await eagerly for a reply. After that comes news from the Allies. Continuing from last week, where members of the Allies discussed how best to support the Finns if war were to occur, it was decided that the safest path to Finland lay by rail from Narvik into Sweden, rather than the more direct northern passage. Between the Germans and the Morgana, relying entirely on maritime shipping and the goodwill of neutrality was too risky a course to take. The Allies would need a dedicated base in Norway, where goods could be consistently unloaded and kept secure, and where the necessary military escorts might replenish and ensure security. The current situation, where both British and German consuls oversaw the loading at the port, would be impossible to maintain. The Norwegians were not enthusiastic, however, given that the Germans would almost certainly take that as a sign that they were aligning definitively with the United Kingdom and France, but an effort to win them over had to be made nonetheless. Following that comes news from the Axis powers, more specifically Germany. Germany had relied on iron from Norwegian ports during winter to keep its war efforts supplied, but it seemed increasingly clear that the current government of Norway might be persuaded to soften their neutrality. Worse so, Narvik was uniquely vulnerable if the Allies chose to intervene in Norway. Such an intervention would also place Lulel under threat. For the Axis to protect its own interests, it would have to cultivate friends of power inside Norway, and to give them the tools to move from the periphery to the center. From the initial outlook, Vidkun Quisling, the founder of the National Samling, seemed to have credibility, experience, energy, and alignment with German goals. It is he who would be cultivated for that specific task. Following the updates from the world's factions comes news from Italy, who continues to make great strides as the leading nation in combating the Morgana threat. Despite the troubling reports of Morgana attacks in Greece last week, the ships of the Regia Marina took the time this week for some well-deserved rest and repair after the Battle of the Alboran Sea alongside the Armada Española, and all the fighting before that through the war plan Riposo y Reparazione. The Belles affected were generally grateful, apart from Pola, who, sources say, vocally protested any suggestion that she might have been unfit for combat. During the downtime, Regio Esercito and Regia Marina representatives met to further collaboration of the two services. Increasingly, it seemed possible that this would be necessary if conflict were to arise from Mussolini's ambitions. Meanwhile, Morgana activity near the Horn of Africa, and worryingly, even the Ligurian Sea, seemed to rise slightly in absence of full patrols. Vanity groups remained visible in the Aegean, drifting among the Cyclades, and periodically burning hand-knit Italian flags. And alongside that, the French ship Bougainville, who was last seen by the sloop Arena Eritrea, was discovered by a scouting flight from the Regia Aeronautica. Bougainville was found to still be under power, but in a ragged course well south of Mogadishu. She was intercepted and boarded by Porto Corsini. Once on board, it was discovered that the wheel had been tied to a heading and the boilers had recently been tended, but of the crew, only the ship's cat that seemed to be present on board. It was stated that after a period of inspection, the ship was to be returned to French authorities. After that, we turn our attention north to hear news from Germany, the second leading nation contributing to the Morgana war effort. This week began with the ending of the German blockade of merchant shipping in the Sound, even as the United Kingdom tightened their own blockade. But it was the Morgana who celebrated this by launching an attack on Rostock early in the morning of December 1st. The bombardment was short-lived and civilian casualties were minimal, though the Warnemünde lighthouse received enough damage to call its structural integrity into question. This marked the first Morgana attack on German possessions for several weeks. Even more suspiciously, however, on December 3rd, sources said that Kriegsmarine vessels east of Rügen received radio transmissions from an unidentified Morgana offering intelligence on any number of Germany's human adversaries, should Germany be willing to send ships to certain coordinates off the Danish west coast to receive it. The Kriegsmarine officer who received the offer responded with, quote, "You, the beasts who attacked Rostock, have nothing to say that we would want to hear," end quote. In the aftermath, their senior leadership wrote a protocol for all future Morgana interactions to minimize the risk of contamination or moral corruption. These guidelines have not been published officially by the Oberkommando der Marine, but were widely distributed in the Baltic Fleet. It was determined later in the week that the source of the transmissions was most likely the Morgana mistrust. Curiously, the Morgana concentrations in the North Sea appeared to settle afterwards. Following that, we head across the Atlantic to hear news from the United States, who are the third contributing nation to our united front. With the tragic sinking of USS Constitution, the people of the nation were directing their fury towards one individual, the Morgana sedition. Despite that, the United States Navy wished to assist the French with Martinique before they went on the hunt, and were somehow able to convince the powers that be, through, albeit unconfirmed reports from the Office of Naval Intelligence about the Morgana near Martinique. However, the United States Navy came late to the Battle of the Lesser Antilles, as the Atlantic Battle Fleet needed to gather its light forces as it progressed down the east coast. The British and French fleets had already departed the waters of the Antilles when the American fleet arrived. The Navy arrived in the general vicinity of San Martin on the 6th of December, where they encountered battle groups that evaded the British and the French and headed north. American scout aircraft first sighted the Morgana engaged in what could only be called a salvage operation of some kind. They had tied an unidentified Morgana hulk to two Injustices, which were raising steam. The snoopers were chased off by fighters from Delusion, and by the time the battle fleet arrived, there was no sign of any such salvage in the area. The Morgana, however, were determined to fight despite being outnumbered. The worst part of the fighting came from a wrathful Delusion who roared that, quote, "the seventh song, or possibly psalm, of all the bees had ended too soon," end quote, before she was sunk. Her aircraft continued harassing the fleet until they too were shot down. The fighting was definitive. By that afternoon, the Battle of the Lesser Antilles was truly over. The American people, it should be said, were not impressed in the least. They wanted sedition dead, wherever she happened to be, and though crushing the Morgana in the Antilles wasn't the worst idea in the world, it wasn't the immediate justice they desired. One of my sources said that some captains of the United States Navy were quite up in arms about the Antilles situation as well, and were quite angrily arguing amongst one another about the outcome in their own war room, claiming the whole effort to be a waste of time. It got heated enough that a Commodore had to step in and warn the beleaguered captains, lest they face more severe punishments. Despite that, Franklin Delano Roosevelt and the more optimistic parts of the Navy were confident that the public would come around. In a series of speeches, the President had already begun to sell the idea of American strength put against Morgana anywhere in the world. Following the battle, there were some troubling finds in the field of debris. The first was that the Morgana fleet in the French Antilles was part of the same construction effort that had polluted the Puerto Rican Trench weeks before. The second was that there was no sign of the hulk the scouts had sighted, nor any Injustices in the fleet that had been destroyed at San Martin, and any film from the surviving scouts was confiscated by the Office of Naval Intelligence. Following that, we take a hop across the pond to hear news from the United Kingdom, the fourth contributing member to our united front. With their Pacific base in Hong Kong strengthened, captains of the Royal Navy looked westward toward the Pacific, Their proposal for action found 78% support within the Houses of Parliament, and the Prime Minister, with the approval of His Majesty, would later announce the enactment of War Plan Back to the New World in response to the growing Morgana fleets off the coast of Martinique. The Battle of the Lesser Antilles began at 1600 hours, on December 4th, when the West Indies station intercepted a flock of avarices bound for St. Kitts and Nevis, and that engagement seemed to rouse the cluster of Morgana that had congregated around newly arrived sloth incarnations from the Atlantic coast of Martinique, all the way north to the lighthouse at La Desirade. Reports stated that dozens of Morgana, including 3 vanities and a delusion who consented to be led by a comrade, surged north. The British ships were agile enough to sally and retreat without taking damage until nightfall, but they had no hope of victory on their own. They did, however, succeed at separating their Morgana pursuers from the cover of their main fleet as planned. At 09:33 on December 5th, a Royal Navy fleet from the North Atlantic Command engaged the Morgana vanguard some 20 kilometers southeast of Antigua, with welcome support from the French forced to raid. The fighting moved southward over the course of the day, culminating just after sunset in a battle off the eastern coast of Martinique. 2 vanities were sunk in the fighting, making it a worthy victory by that alone. The rest of the Morgana, led by a sabotage, fled from the northern coast of Île Petite Grenade southwards. The entire experience was something of a triumph for the Allies, and for the Royal Navy coordination in particular, given the skill with which the West Indies and North Atlantic forces meshed. It made for good local news as well, and throughout the British Antilles, and indeed as far north as Bermuda, recruitment spiked. The bulk of the home fleet, meanwhile, sought to avoid a repeat of corruption's doings around the Irish coast. The sortie left the North Sea unfortunately open to the Kriegsmarine, but a light guard would have to do for the time being. Sin had begun to push her way into the western approaches, but she was met with the fleet before she could take root. As it was December in the approaches, her principal advantages were nullified, and the Royal Navy had little trouble sinking or dispersing this new threat to trade. Meanwhile, in the Indian Ocean, the mysterious fleet in the Seychelles drifted in and out of sight like a hellish mirage, and its presence seemed to embolden the Morgana near the Maldives. This fleet had not yet troubled the trade lanes, but it seemed to be ever growing. In other news, on the 3rd of December, a raid of Wellingtons attacked Heligoland, targeting the naval base there. Intense concentrations of anti-aircraft fire disrupted the majority of the attack, but post-mission analysis photography showed that in just a week the German constructions on the island had nearly completed. It was later stated that Pembroke VII had confiscated all the film from the raid. And a final note, the Navisert system was instituted this week, further tightening the blockade on Germany and independent nations, including Italy. Following that, we head across the Pacific to the Empire of Japan, who is the 5th contributing nation in a war against the Morgana. After escorting the United States Pacific Fleet to safe waters, there was a quandary still yet to be faced in the South China Sea. Delusion had struck Haikou and gathered untold amounts of glass for an unknown purpose, and with a mysterious curtain of fog beginning to descend on the region, such a danger was not something captains of the Imperial Japanese Navy were going to allow. With 72% in support, they enacted the war plan Delusion Dilemma, the big risk, in order to shatter Delusion's fantasy in the region. Observation of Delusion's pattern of activity suggested that she would be found at the Paracel Islands. IJ and Nagato promptly led the scouting fleet, along with elements of the 3rd Fleet, to hunt through a profoundly disorienting sea of Morgana mist in pursuit of broadcasts promising the imminent destruction of Formosa, Delusion's revenge for the rout weeks before. Steaming at speed in the mists in an area known for treacherous changes in depth was dangerous, but the navigators of the fleet were more than adequate to the challenge. Air raids from Delusion into narrow channels had the potential for disaster, but fortunately only a few ships suffered splinter damage as bombs exploded nearby. What they found was not the main Delusion battle group, but rather a single fleet firing wildly at the remains of an abandoned guano collection station on Pratas Island. Despite the miss, the Morgana were caught by surprise and quickly defeated, but the main Delusion was nowhere to be found. IJ and Nagato retired north, and the air attacks continued unabated on seemingly random bearings until the fleet cleared the mists. Running the gauntlet caused more damage, but no ships were lost in the end. The Imperial Japanese Navy's efforts in the South China Sea were certainly successful in keeping the Morgana presence low, but the primary destruction remained vexingly active. In other news, the Admiralty began updating the fleet with new codes, starting with the battle fleet at Hashirajima. American codebreakers have named this variant JN-25A, reports say. Meanwhile, in the north, the Morgana infestation around the Strait of Tartary was beginning to cast a shadow over Karafudo. In northern China, a significant attack on Haifeng appears to be developing, and in the south, Chinese forces are massing near the Kunlun Pass. However, no further supplies will reach the Chinese now that Nanning has fallen. The Prime Minister exudes confidence that it's only a matter of time before the incident is resolved and peace returns to the continent. Following that, we head back over to Europe to hear news from France, the sixth contributing member against the Morgana threat. After having received reports of amassing Morgana fleets both outside Madagascar and Martinique, the Ladier's government was split on a course of action. After much debate, the latter proposal found 66% support, and as such it was decided that Martinique could no longer wait. The war plan Murder at Martinique was passed, and orders were issued for the force to raid the sortie immediately. The Battle of the Lesser Antilles actually began some 17 hours before the arrival of the force to raid, and its Royal Navy allies from the North Atlantic Command, the West Indies Station, aware of the oncoming Allied fleets, intercepted a flock of avarices bound for St. Kitts and Nevis, and all hell broke loose. At 09:33 on December 5th, the force to raid and the Royal Navy's North Atlantic forces engaged the Morgana vanguard separated by some distance from their main fleet, 20 kilometers southeast of Antigua. The Allied forces scattered the vanguard and chased the bulk of the fleet further south, where the main Morgana fleet began a steady withdrawal. At first, the French held back, fearing a trap, but the British pressed on and quickly showed that the Morgana were in earnest. The Allied fleets pushed the Morgana beyond their endurance, and as the sun set, their orderly withdrawal became a rout. Their final organized rally took place just outside the Baie du Francois at night and was swiftly crushed. The Morgana fought savagely, damaging nearly the whole of the force to raid and sinking MN Le Moulin after a bitter engagement. The rest of the Morgana, led by a sabotage, fled from the northern coast of Île Petite Grenade southwards. The force to raid immediately turned about to make for Brest at best speed, damaged and exhausted, but there was nothing faster in the French fleet, and they might well be needed again. Closing out the naval action, there were two oddities observed. The first was that the Morgana appeared to have deployed to cover a withdrawal, despite their superior numbers. The second was that this deployment did not have the appearance of a trap, which the French expected. Despite that, it was an overall triumph for the Allies, and particularly for the exhausted crews of the Marine Nationale, and a kind of liberation for the French Antilles. Fishing boats could work safely again, all while screening Morgana radio broadcasts came to a very welcome end. Meanwhile, closer to home, despair came slinking back into the western Mediterranean, apparently little bothered by her allies' defeat in the Battle of the Alboran Sea just days before. Mischief, meanwhile, drifted back and forth in the Manche, muttering over the radio that if the Marine Nationale didn't want to play her games, then she would think up more exciting ones. In other news, MN Bougainville was discovered by an Italian scouting flight, still under power but in a ragged course well south of Mogadishu. She was intercepted and boarded by the Italian gunboat Porto Corsini. It had been found that the wheel had been tied to a heading and the boilers recently tended, but the crew was completely absent. The ship's cat was the only one still found on board. The Italians have stated that after an inspection they will return her to French authorities. And a final note, the French government approached the governments of Belgium and the Netherlands with an expansive proposal for ensuring their mutual defense. It was received with caution, however, as no further signs of German designs in the Low Countries have been noted. Lastly, but certainly not least, comes news from our comrades in the North, the Soviet Union, who are the seventh contributing member to our united front. Following the growing tensions between the Soviets and the Finnish, orders came direct from Moscow enacting the war plan Assault Porvoo to blockade and occupy Finnish territory to apply pressure towards Helsinki. Sources say only 66% of the Politburo were in support of this. Upon hearing the orders, the Red Navy, operating out of the Russian and Estonian bases in the Baltic, departed on the morning of November 30th to occupy the principal Finnish islands. On December 1st, they seized the island of Siiskari, where the Finnish garrison escaped on a schooner. Other landing forces took Lavansari Island, while the main fleet continued on to capture the remainder of the Mid-Gulf Islands. The whole operation was completed against minimal opposition by the 3rd of December. That same day, Kirov and her escorts dueled with the coastal fortifications at Rusaru, before being driven off by a combination of heavy weather and the guns of the enemy. She was lightly damaged in the engagement. The Baltic Fleet staged amphibious landings near Porvoo and Helsinki, starting at daybreak on December 6, with the intention of disrupting Finnish defenses and exposing the capital to direct assault. The weather was stormy and unreasonably cold, and seemingly made worse by the strange weather patterns being created in the Baltic. It was a bold move, but plagued with complications from the start. Porvoo was defended by the 3rd Coastal Brigade, and while their gunnery was not highly accurate, it was enough to damage several transports. The shortness of the day initially benefited the Soviets, but ultimately did not work in their favor. Troops were delivered in enough numbers to briefly take most of the town, but the Finnish response from Helsinki was swift, and by the 7th it was clear that the naval infantry would need to be withdrawn. It was certainly a learning experience for the Soviets, but not a pleasant one. Nightfall came too soon for exploiting landings, and the transport ship suffered multiple collisions even before a Maus group came along and started taking pot shots at them. Autumn was heavily damaged by the Morgana, but survived the encounter. It became clear, too, that the front in Karelia was not generally collapsing. Turkey had been taken, but further advances were stalled by strong defenses. Ilmarinen and the remainder of the Finnish fleet were believed to be at Hanko, but they did not sortie. FAS Väinämöinen's whereabouts are not known either. In other news, later in the week, the Soviets made a proposal to Berlin regarding basing rights on the White Sea and on the Kamchatka Peninsula, in exchange for submarine support in the Baltic against the Morganas and the Finns alike. And a final note, in the Far East, the Morgana presence in the Strait of Tartary continued to fester, and smaller Morgana vessels became increasingly common, probing the defenses of the Amur River mouth. Reports state the local populations were terrified, but the Pacific Fleet was still in no position to act. And with that concludes the League of Nations War Report for the first week of December. With the Morgana threat precariously pushing humanity towards a cliff, it's sad to see that conflict amongst ourselves is beginning to flare once more. While some said it was inevitable, we hoped it would be avoidable. Hopefully, the future will still look kindly upon us. And as a reminder to all captains and citizens alike that this League of Nations broadcast is intended on keeping you informed about the unified war effort against the Morgana, but there is more you can do to help both on the front and at home. Has a captain or barrel caught your eye? Utilize some of that prestige you've earned to get them a tailored uniform or some nice formal dress wear for the upcoming holidays. If you find yourself lacking in prestige to woo your fellow officers, consider buying some war bonds to help the war effort against the Morgana. It's the quickest way you can support our boys and girls on the front line while also netting you fame among your peers that you can use to get that special someone regalia befitting only of them. Thank you for listening, and may you have smooth seas.